Good afternoon and welcome to LBMA webinars. Today we have Responsible Sourcing Report 2021, a continuous improvement, led by Sakhila Mirza, who will be hosting Neil Harvey and Alan Martin, all LBMA employees and all very much involved in the Responsible Sourcing Report. Before I hand over to them, I am going to take you through a quick housekeeping slide. So if you do have any questions, we do have question time at the end. Please let us know. We do want to hear them. So you should see a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you can't see that, can't find it, don't know what I'm talking about, do send us an email to ask@lbma.org.uk and we'll make sure that either Alan, Neil and Sakhila get that during the webinar or after the webinar. If you're watching this back recorded later. So without further ado, Sakhila, I shall hand over.
Great. Well, thank you, Taylor, and welcome everybody, because I believe this is the last webinar of 2021. So who else better to end the webinar series than myself, Neil and Alan, who are going to talk you through perhaps one of the most important subject matters when it comes to the precious metals industry, responsible sourcing. So today we'll be focusing on the responsible sourcing report that we launched a few weeks ago. If you haven't had time to read it, certainly this webinar will provide you a little bit of background, but the devil's in the details. So please do read the report. There's a lot more information in the report than what we will be covering today. And if you have any questions after reading the report, get in touch. We'll be more than delighted to help answer your questions. And any feedback you may have on the report is also always welcomed. So in terms of the webinar, we're just going to focus very high level quickly in terms of the strategy, where we are. Also cover, again, very high level, the Responsible Gold Guidance version 9, give you an update in terms of the performance for 2020, discuss the all-important data set, the country of origin data, and then updates on the International Bullion Centres work, as well as a quick update in terms of what's happening next year and thereafter. We do welcome questions. We do want this to be interactive whilst there is a formal presentation. So do send in your questions. Taylor, do stop me if you think there's a question that I should answer as we're going through the slides. So moving on to the next slide. So one thing I would like to sort of start with, and perhaps one of the most important messages that we do like to highlight over and over again, is the LBMA's commitment to continuous improvement. Responsible Sourcing Program, as most of you know, we launched it in 2012. And over the years, we've been very focused on continually improving our standards and recognizing that we can always do more and actually improve best practices. And we've done that, and we are continuing to do that, and we remain committed to doing that. However, when it comes to responsible sourcing, everybody across the value chain has a commitment to responsible supply chains, from upstream all the way down to the downstream. Every actor is committed and should be committed to responsible sourcing. The LBMA's role is to work with the various actors in the supply chain, as you can see by this wonderful chart, and to understand how can we together advance standards. Again, doesn't matter where you are in the value chain, how can we work together, because the supply chain does need to come together when it comes to understanding and improving best practices and standards. And we want to strengthen that engagement as we continue developing our program as well. The next slide, and thanks, Taylor. So for those who remember when we used to have conferences in person, the last in-person conference was in Shenzhen, we announced 5 strategic focus areas for the LBMA when it comes to the Responsible Sourcing Program. Transparency, it's so important that there's a lot that goes on. There's a lot of information that we all hold, we all sort of are exposed to. How can we improve that transparency and improve those disclosure requirements? A lot of work has been done through our disclosure guidance and obviously through RGG 9, which I'll mention in the next slide. But this is something that we require feedback on. What else can be done? We have roadmaps in place in understanding what the disclosure requirements are going to look like in a few years' time. What is missing? How can we further strengthen those requirements? Advancing standards says what it says on the tin. RGG9 is doing exactly that. We're looking to, again, advance those standards of in terms of the responsible sourcing when it comes to the audit program itself. And obviously the audit program itself, working with the auditors in making sure they understand what it is that they're doing when they audit against the responsible sourcing guidance. The value chain accountability, everybody has a role to play. We've already highlighted the actual value chain itself, but then there's also a role for national authorities and governments. So we launched the International Bullion Centres work, which I'll cover towards the end in terms of where we are. And it's actually engaging with the national authorities to support a lot of the industry initiatives, projects, and understanding where we can actually leverage value to help the industry move forward. Those were the last part, by no means the least, is the support for artisanal mining and how do we meaningfully create responsible demand for ASM. Again, this is covered in this presentation. I know Alan and Neil will be talking about this a little bit later, but LBMA remains committed to working with on-the-ground projects to help with responsibly sourced ASM. This is what we launched in 2019. In 2022, so that's next year, we will be revisiting these priorities, whether they're the right priorities. It will be the end of the 3 years strategic program. We will be developing the next 3 years strategic program, and actually sustainability will form a major part of the next 3 year strategic plan. Sustainability is a much broader agenda in terms of the responsible sourcing. So we will be welcoming feedback from other sort of industry experts on what should those priorities be when we look at the sustainability agenda. So more on this next year, and something that we would like to work with the industry on. So let's move on to the responsible sourcing program itself. So this is the audit program that the LBMA has worked on for several years now. It's grown substantially. There is no shortage of work that's being done by refiners, auditors, or the LBMA. As this slide shows, there's obviously guidance, there's a lot of guidance in place in terms of the requirements and what's expected from refiners. But then there's a lot of tools in place to help with the implementation of those requirements and making sure that those documents remain relevant and actually support the industry expectations on what is required to ensure responsible supply chains. On the auditor side, again, supporting their understanding of the gold market, the silver market, because there's not just the responsible gold guidance, there's also the responsible silver guidance, but also focusing on the training programs and how do we help the auditors better understand the market that we actually work in. So communications between the refiners, the auditors, and the LBMA is absolutely essential to help with the development of this program. On the LBMA side, we've also developed a lot of what we do when it comes to our enforcement, our governance. We have regular meetings through the compliance panel, which is a much more sort of formal structured review panel that looks at the audits and actually reviews those audits in a lot more detail. You've obviously got support from the physical committee who challenge the LBMA on where they believe that they need more answers, that there might be gaps on how we can actually improve the standards and requirements, but also, you know, looking at that country of origin data, how can we use that data to better understand the flows, the market, and the challenges and the risks, and where can we concentrate some of our efforts better? So that's all that's been happening over the last several years. But that list isn't going to stop there. I mean, it's only going to grow and it's only going to strengthen over the time. And perhaps the biggest area for 2021 was the development of the RGG9. So this is the Responsible Gold Guidance version 9. If you move on to the next slide, RGG9 has doubled in size. It's gone from something like 20 pages to 40 pages. And that sort of idea about doubling in size should highlight that the list of requirements, the expectation on the refiners has also increased significantly. This is as a result of feedback from the industry, learning sort of from version 8, what do we need, what's missing, how much more information do we need? How do we meaningfully work with the refiners in making sure that we're actually addressing market expectations, but also helping them with meeting those expectations and the implementation of those requirements. We launched 2 consultations this year. One was over the summer, one was a few months ago, and asking for feedback in terms of the first draft and then the second draft of what's missing, where are the gaps, have we gone too far on version 9? Maybe we need to sort of park some of it for version 9 and actually address it in version 10 to allow for better implementation. You know, the refiners are given 12 months to implement the next version. That's always been the case. When we went from version 7 to version 8, refiners were given 12 months. When we go from version 8 to version 9, refiners will be given 12 months. So what can be meaningfully done in 12 months to ensure that refiners are looking at this and actually addressing the expectations of version 9 appropriately? So you can't achieve everything in version 9. So, you know, through that engagement, through the consultation, we have actually taken some sections out, not because we don't think it's important, but we think for the next iteration, that's when it becomes more relevant. Allow the refiners to put those building blocks in place and then build on it at the next stage of the responsible sourcing program. So then focusing on version 9 more specifically, if you move to the next slide, Taylor, please. A lot of changes coming down the pipeline. There's a lot more focus on recycled gold, a lot more detail in terms of what are the expectations and the requirements and the due diligence expectations. Perhaps a lot more detail has been fleshed out on the ESG risk assessment and what the requirements are. To remind everybody, version 8 was the first time we extended the scope of the due diligence requirements to ESG. We've now taken that version 8 and we've provided a lot more detail in 9. So that's definitely something that's going to take a lot of time in the next 12 months for refiners to implement. We've provided more clarity on the risk mitigation. We've encouraged the elimination of cash. Yes, we've provided some controlled exceptions. Again, read the guidance to understand how those exceptions work. We are trying to support through the guidance for a more responsible ASM, but also looking at this more from a independence, more from a quality assurance, looking at providing a 10-year rotation for auditors, but also making sure that the disclosure guidance that we implemented 2 years ago, which we launched towards the end of 2019, making sure that that is going to be aligned with the expectations of the RGG9 as well. And finally, we've provided a lot more clarity on the origin and actually the data that we would be requesting from refiners and the information that they will be sharing with us. So a lot more detail is provided in the guidance itself. And again, if there are aspects that you saw in the first draft that haven't made it to the final draft, that's not because we don't think it's necessary. That's because we think it's necessary, but at the next stage of the development program. So with that, I just want to quickly run through the timelines so everybody's clear. So the guidance is going to be launched next week. So we are going to give refiners a 12-month implementation period. So whilst it launches next week, it becomes effective from the 1st of January 2022. With the 12 months implementation, the first set of audit reports will be received in 2023. Now, with any implementation, whenever there's been a new version, I think you have to manage expectations in terms of the results of the audits. We are fully expecting there to be probably an increase in non-conformances in 2023. That's because during the implementation period, there usually are teething problems in understanding the requirements have actually met the expectations, in understanding what procedural changes were made, what management systems and controls changed, did they go far enough? If they didn't go far enough, what are the recommendations from the auditors? What are the corrective action plans to remediate against the non-conformances? So I do want to highlight non-conformances does not mean that this is a terrible audit or the refiner has not done a good job. Non-conformances actually allows for a constructive dialogue to help improve the practices and compliance with RGG9. Obviously, if there's a zero tolerance is exactly that. The refiner gets removed immediately and they are then not allowed back on the good delivery list for a good 5 years. But non-conformances means that there needs to be a corrective action plan if it's high or medium risk, and let's engage and work better together to address any of those in the time period that is relevant. Auditors guidance will also be updated to support the implementation of version 9 in early 2022. Training will be provided to make sure that they understand what the expectations are when it comes to the audit. And then looking ahead, we are going to be focusing a lot more on sort of what is the practical steps to help with ASM, but also start looking at RGG 10. What should the RGG 10 include? What is the scope? What is the disclosure requirements? And actually also work with the industry in looking at that roadmap for better transparency, or shall we say, improved disclosure requirements. So that's the timeline, and that's where the program is headed in the coming years. I'm now going to hand over to Alan, who's going to be a bit reflective in terms of what have the refiners been up to in the last 12 months, that's in 2022, auditors' performance, and also a little bit of an update for those who are not familiar with what happens at the LBMA when you receive a report, what's the process that the LBMA engages. So Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Sakhila. Well, as you said, I thought maybe a good starting place was to talk about what responsible sourcing really entails at the LBMA. And I know this is a conversation you, Neil, and I have been having as some trading centres begin to design their responsible sourcing programs. And of course, you mentioned the RGG. It's the rule book, if you will, that governs the obligations and expectations that we have for good delivery list refiners. And one criteria is that refiners need to submit to LBMA an annual independent audit of their sourcing practices. And this is not voluntary; it's a mandatory requirement of our refiners. And all reports as they come in, usually they're based around the end of the calendar year, the financial year, sorry, which usually aligns with the calendar year. These reports come in and they are assessed by the responsible sourcing team. And this is by no means a rubber stamp process. It's something we scrutinize any non-conformances or vulnerabilities that are identified by the auditors. We ask questions about things we think might be missing from the report. We challenge both the refiners and the auditors to justify the conclusions. Sometimes we will bring in issues that we might have read about or heard about in supply chains or from particular countries of concern. So once we're satisfied with that process, and it can go on sometimes for weeks, going back and forth with the auditors and the refiners. But once we're satisfied with that assessment, we write up an assessment which with a recommendation either to approval or not. With low risk assessments, these are usually approved by Neil and myself. Neil, as people know, is our Chief Technical Officer. Understands a lot more about the details about the actual refining process and materiality and that kind of expertise. The medium and high risk refiners or reports that have medium and high risk non-conformances are referred to the monthly compliance panel, which we call the COMPAN. And this is comprised of our CEO, Ruth Cole, Sakhila, Neil, Varsha Paris, who's our good delivery list officer, and myself. And the process generally, I think it really greatly improves the governance of the entire responsible sourcing program. The senior leadership of LBMA is exposed to the challenges amongst refiners, and they have an opportunity to feedback their opinions and insights into the assessment process, which is then obviously conveyed to refiners themselves. And the mandate of the COMPAN essentially covers anything that touches on responsible sourcing. It's a very broad brush, but it includes things such as the applications from new audit firms that are looking to join our approved list of auditors, incidents and grievances related to refiners, or the capacity challenges of auditors. And as another aspect of this is incident review processes. And these really cover serious incidences that happen outside of the audit process that could impact the GDL status of a refiner. And these incidents might come to us either through media or NGO reports, or sometimes even our own sources or intelligence. And the IRP follows an 11-step process by which the substance of any allegations are presented to the refiner for a response. And this here, the cooperation by refiners is mandatory. And should the allegations be found to be true, a refiner is liable to be suspended, perhaps subject to a corrective action plan, or in the most extreme cases, can be removed from the good delivery list. And so while the process is led by the responsible sourcing team and discussed at compound, the ultimate decision on suspensions or removal are made by the executive board of LBMA. Next slide, please. I thought this would, Sakhila mentioned our responsible sourcing report that came out earlier this month, and I just wanted to highlight a few of some of the numbers that are drawn from that report. As you can see by the graph on the right-hand side, there was a marked drop in the number of non-conformances last year. And as Sakhila mentioned, I think the main reason for this is that 2019 was an implementation year for the new RGG, or the then new RGG version 8. And every time a new version is launched, the numbers spike as refiners adjust to the new normal and the new obligations that they have to meet. And we expect to see the same jump again in 2023 when the new version 9 reports start to be implemented and coming into our office. On balance, I think last year was actually quite a positive year in that there was no zero tolerances or high-risk non-conformances. We had one refiner who was found to be non-compliant, but brought itself back into compliance with the help of a correction action plan. Next slide, please. I think there's, again, the report highlights 3 case studies that gather a bit of the breadth of some of the issues that our refiners face. And there's one that involved the Perth Mint, that involved an IRP, following media allegations around concerns of an aggregator that was sourcing artisanal production in Papua New Guinea. And that was a process that involved a correction action plan. At the end of it, Perth addressed all the issues, actually implemented a lot of new management systems that greatly improved what was there prior to that. And since then, in the report that they've given us for 2020, there was no issues at all in their supply chain. The PX Presinox example or case study, I think, is also a very unique one. It was one, again, where there was allegations of illegal behavior by some suppliers to an aggregator that it works with, which provides artisanal production. The refiner was quite confident of its systems and its due diligence. It stuck with the aggregator as the investigation went on, and in the end, the allegations were proven to be without merit, and there was no investigation or criminal charges laid against either Presinox or its aggregator. And I think this is a good example about risk mitigation and engaging with suppliers in instances where there might be some difficulties. I think this is something that sometimes gets lost in the discussion around compliance with the OECD due diligence framework. Sometimes people would prefer an immediate suspension as opposed to actually trying to mitigate and improve those any allegations that might have arisen. And again, in that instance with Presinox, the relationship continues, and there've been no further issues brought to our attention. I think the third one relates to PAMP and MMTC PAMP and its sourcing from the North Mara mine in Tanzania. There was a lot of legacy issues around human rights abuses, which were brought to our attention, and both the refiner and Barrick, through the consultancy services of Synergy, which is a Paris-based consultancy, have worked to essentially mitigate those concerns. And I think we're very happy to see that since that process has begun, that there have been no further issues raised in terms of concerns around human rights abuses. And again, I think that's another good example of continuing to engage through periods of turbulence. Next slide, please. The role of auditors is a very critical function or aspect of the responsible sourcing program. And as we say, that an auditor is only as good as the auditor. And so I think we work a lot with auditors to try and ensure that they are aware of some of the concerns we have. There's been some instances that have been raised during the course of the year, for example, with certain countries. We'll raise those with refiners and auditors that work in those countries to bring it to their attention. We also do a lot of training. We have a training scheduled later this month, where we are essentially offering a refresher course to our auditors, so they're aware of all the aspects of the responsible growth guidance. Participation is mandatory. And there's also an exam at the end of that to ensure that they have understood the issues correctly. If there's any, I think we've set a minimum bar of 70% pass rate. Any auditor that falls below that, we will engage on a one-to-one basis to understand what the concerns are or vulnerabilities and challenges and improve their understanding of that. There'll be a second training scheduled for early next year, where we'll talk about the material differences between version 8 and version 9 of the RGG. I think also just from a quality control perspective, we also do have an annual review of auditors to ensure that they are providing good quality work. There have been instances where we've had to remove auditors for poor performance, but luckily that has not happened this year. But it's one thing that we're always constantly aware of to ensure that the quality of the audits is up to snuff. And I think I'll pass the baton over to Neil. I think, Neil, maybe you can give us a sense of some of the country of origin data that came out of the report.
Hey, thank you, Alan. Yeah, so no offense, Alan and Sakhila, we're now going to get to the interesting part of the webinar. Data tells you a lot, and if you understand data and you've got correct data, you can learn a lot from that data. So each of the refineries, as you know, on an annual basis, has to provide information to the LBMA as to where every ounce of gold has been sourced from, what form it is in, and how much is being sourced. Now, last year in this report, next slide, please. Last year, when we put out this report, was the first year that we had a full set of data for 2018, which was, again, it was a real sort of eye-opener as to understand where gold is coming from, where gold is going to. And please read the report. It goes into a lot more detail than we could have a webinar just on the data. But have a look at the data. What we've got now is 2019, and we can start to look at trends. We can start to look at where things are changing, and we need to understand what those changes are, because the gold is going to keep moving. We have to understand where it's coming from and where it's going to. The other thing that we're learning is that data has multiple sources, and one of the things that we do is compare our data with other known sources. So mine production data, for example, import-export numbers, and recognition of Metals Focus, who we like to sit down with and say, I'll show you my results and you show me your numbers, and we can see where the differences are, and we can try to understand those differences. And there are some very interesting discussions. Next slide, please. So again, I'm not asking you to look at this slide, but these are the tables that are in the report, and we've tried to design it in such a way that you can compare year on year. We do accept that this data is getting better. We do accept that we are learning. And one of the things that's coming out of, for example, RGG 9 is really understanding the recycled gold flows, because mined gold is relatively easy. You can see the mine on a map, you know where it's coming from, you know where it's going to, that makes sense. Recycled gold is quite different. And for example, grandfathered stocks, when they start to move, certain import-export codes won't pick that up because it's not being refined, it's just being converted in their eyes. Whereas we pick up all of the gold going into the refineries and all of the gold coming out of the refineries. So we've tried to make it as granular as we can. We do respect that the source of the data, the refineries, we have to be careful. And that's why it is grouped in the way it is, that if a country has 4 or more refiners, we can treat it as a country. But obviously, if a country only has 1 refinery, it's quite clear that we would be publishing their data, you know, in its granular form. And we don't want to do that. We want to be respectful of the source data, and that way we gain the trust and we can make better use of the data. Next slide, please. So some interesting things if you compare. LSM, year on year, pretty much the same, much hasn't changed. Similar with recycled material. And it's still in that similar sort of ratio where the refineries do more recycled gold than they do LSM. Again, coming back to recycled definitions, we hope to get more granularity on exactly the true source of the recycled gold. And that's where a lot of work needs to be done to identify the true source of the gold and the true type of gold, so that you don't get ASM being passed off as recycled gold. On to the sad thing, and it's getting worse. From 2018 to 2019, the ASM number, despite our best efforts and our champion of causes, has reduced again. And what's even more shocking is that 22 tonnes in 2019 is only really done in less than a handful of our GDL refineries. And this is a recognition. There are a couple of refineries in Switzerland who account for 33% of the ASM being refined globally. And just to recognise that those 2 refineries in Switzerland are doing a fantastic job. Okay, next slide, please. So ASM, like I've said, is something that we are very, very concerned about. And I want to hand back to Alan to discuss ASM.
Thanks for that, Neil. I think that, as he mentioned, we're spending quite a lot of effort to think about ways of improving this decline in direct sourcing. Sakhila and I were at the Swiss Gold Day earlier in November, which was a very good opportunity to meet with some refiners and NGOs that work in this space, and to open the conversation about how LBMA can perhaps serve as a facilitator between NGOs that work on the ground, have a presence on the ground, to understand the nuances and the challenges of sourcing, responsible sourcing in high risk areas. Ways of trying to partner them with refiners who are looking to directly source ASM material rather than getting it on the secondary market through recycled material. And so I guess I could say stay tuned, but I think we do plan to make more announcements about this early in 2022. Probably start with some kind of feasibility study that looks at the different models and approaches that could be used to de-risk the material. I think we're very familiar with the reasons why big refiners, for reputational reasons, stay away from ASM. I think that's one of the unintended consequences a due diligence system, and I know we've had a discussion with the OECD about this, about perhaps putting this on the agenda 10 years on from both the guidance and the RGG to think about ways in which the unintended consequences can perhaps be mitigated, and ways that we can address as an industry and also as a collective community of NGOs that work in that space to try and make the material more palatable to refiners, because it definitely needs a collective approach to solving this issue. But I think we'll be making more announcements later on. But I'll pass that on to Neil to discuss this other slide.
So that the ASM was one aspect that's coming out of the data. The other thing that we'd like to just move on to now is another work stream that we've been working on, which is the International Bullion Centres. And again, what the data gives us is it gives credence to what we're trying to do here. So what this slide is showing is, if you look at the International Bullion Centres that have 4 or more refineries, using the same philosophy as the other data, is that we've split it down according to those bullion centres, and you can see where the challenges are. And so, for example, if you look at Switzerland, quite clearly there's not a lot of gold mines in Switzerland, but they're doing an awful lot of LSM from around the world. There's that little ASM spike that you see there. But what this shows you is, this is the reason why we're looking at the specific IBCs that we're looking at. And I know Sakhila wants to elaborate on the work we're doing with the IBCs.
Yeah, thanks, Neil and Alan. So, a nice segue into a quick update on the International Bullion Centres work. So the next slide, please, Taylor. So we launched the IBC Recommendations a year ago, and we focused on 3 strategic objectives. Based on the data, we believed that we need to focus more on understanding the responsible sourcing of recycled gold. Also supporting the elimination of cash transactions, and lastly, I know this has come up a few times, supporting responsible ASM. So these were the 3 strategic sort of priorities that the LBMA identified a year ago. And in response to those priorities, we provided 5 recommendations, and this was in line with the OECD requirements, but also in line with the audit program that we have in place for our refiners. And basically a request from national authorities to help the industry initiatives and support them with the whole overall responsible sourcing agenda. Audit programs are absolutely necessary and they are effective, but their effectiveness is limited. So whilst they help us to understand in terms of what the sort of management system controls, the risks, on their own, they're not enough. So this is where we do need support from the actual responsible sourcing ecosystem, and the national authorities are part of that ecosystem. So getting support from them on actually, their rules, their regulations, and actually presenting to them where we think they can help us has been really helpful for us. But also I'm hoping that they would agree that it's been helpful for them to understand what we need to help our work as well. So we identified a number of centres, 12 centres, and we spoke to them all through the year, and we got good engagement from all of them in terms of a commitment to responsible sourcing, the OECD requirements. Simultaneously, but separately, the OECD also held a meeting with the centres and bringing the centres together to actually exchange and share information on what can be done, what are the next steps to advance the responsible sourcing standards. So whilst we've got a commitment from all the centres, it's now understanding, right, what's next? What are we doing with this information? What are we doing with the recommendations? So moving on to the next slide, you will see that, engagement with the centres, that's happened. OECD intergovernment meeting. The inaugural meeting was earlier this year. The next meeting is being scheduled as we speak. I think they're just agreeing some dates. We have tried to strengthen our communications and engagement with the Financial Action Task Force Absolutely, 100%. We support the recommendations that they put out, and then we would like to understand how the centres take those recommendations and implement those recommendations to the extent that they are relevant. So what we are now doing internally within the LBMA is understanding the progress within each centre. Every centre has been engaged in working on the agenda, but everybody's at a different stage, at a different level. We are trying to collate what is publicly available, and then through our engagement and meetings with the centres to understand what their agenda is, what they are looking at, and then also seeing what the data is telling us. So we are developing a methodology internally to help us with a review of each of the centres we've identified, which will then help us in 2022 to further the discussions with the centres in understanding what is happening next, where there has been good progress, what the LBMA is doing, and where we've made progress or where we could make further progress together. And through those discussions, hopefully working together to improve and raise the bar when it comes to those standards. So that's 2022. There was a lot of discussion last year in terms of what does it mean if these recommendations don't get met, what happens next, what are the next steps? Like I said, we've had commitment from all the centres. Of course, over the year, there's been different speed at which the centres are working at. In 22, we're going to have more information and better information through our own review in understanding where the centres have gotten to and what's happening next. So that's been a positive outcome for us, at least this year. And we actually move this forward next year through our own internal analysis as well. So that then takes me on nicely to our concluding slide, the future. So what's next? Well, as I've already said, the big announcement on this webinar is the implementation, or the launch rather, of RGG9 next week. It has been finalized, it has been agreed. We are now just finalizing some of the communications around it, and it will be launched next week. So watch this space. And again, we encourage you to get in touch if you do not understand what it's saying, you want some clarification, or you just want to share some of your feedback as to what you think of RGG9 and what you think should happen next. In 2022, we are also going to be looking at the next 3-year strategy for responsible sourcing and actually broadening that agenda to include sustainability. With that, we are looking at holding a Sustainability and Responsible Sourcing Summit early part of next year. So more details, dates, and all this sort of information will follow in the coming weeks. And finally, I've already mentioned the IBC recommendations, engaging with the centres, engaging with the OECD, engaging with FATF, and obviously the value chain actors in understanding how we can all come together to continue to meaningfully improve and develop the standards. So with that, we're going to conclude the presentation element of the webinar. We do encourage any questions, although I don't see any at the moment. That might just because there is a lot of information we've shared. So you may want to go back and think about what we've said and come back to us with questions. But I will pause for just a few seconds in case if anybody wants to either raise their hand or ask a question. Okay, I will take silence to be that we've overwhelmed you death by information, but when you all do recover, please do get in touch. The program is only as good as the feedback we receive. Like I said, we can't always reflect the feedback instantly, but the information is kept. We do look to reflect it at later stages. So with that, thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to further engagement. Taylor, over to you for any final sort of comments.
Yes, thank you. As Sakhila did say, if you do have any questions, just email us at ask@lbma.org.uk if you're listening back to this recorded, or if you were here live, I'll make sure that they get across to Neil, Sakhila and Alan. A big thank you to the three of you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us. It's very greatly appreciated. That's it for this webinar, but I do have a few things to update you on. So this is the last webinar of 2021, and we'll be returning in January in 2022. So we'll announce the details about those webinars at the beginning of the year. But we do have a few events in December, our final events for the year. We have our LBMA seminar and the LBMA, LBPM, IPMI dinner. Add another acronym. I don't think there's enough in that sentence. So we're going to be having those next Wednesday for members and guests. So it'll be a very busy day for us at LBMA. Following that, on Thursday the 2nd, we have Introduction to Low Code London, and on Friday the 3rd, we have How to Use Low Code London. So those courses are led by Emma Jenkins, and they're very, very informative. So we do have a few places left, so please do send us a message if you want to get along to either or both. We will be distributing the information for that in the coming days. So please do get in touch. And I will do one final plug for our conference via the webinars this year. So we have our launch sale rate, which expires on the 31st of December. So there's a considerable discount on that ticket for both members and non-members. So do encourage you to get along to our website and purchase those tickets if you do know you're going to come. Otherwise, the price will go up as of the 1st of January. But again, if you have any questions, just send us an email, or you can always visit our website or any of our social media accounts to find out more. So with that, thank you, Neil. Thank you, Sakhila. Thank you, Alan, who's gotten up very early this morning. And I hope everybody else has an absolutely wonderful afternoon and the weekend ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you then. Bye.